The city street was unusually crowded that day. People were moving fast, some rushing to work, others wandering with shopping bags. Everything looked normal until the sudden sound of sirens broke the morning calm. Police cars arrived and blocked the intersection. Their lights flashing red and blue, the officers shouted for people to step back. Nobody understood what was happening, but the tension in the air grew heavier every second. In the middle of the street stood a black car, parked near the corner. It looked ordinary, nothing special, but a shopkeeper nearby had reported it as suspicious. Someone thought it had been left there too long. Someone else claimed they saw wires inside. Rumors spread quickly. The police believed it could be dangerous, maybe even a threat. The officers acted fast. They didn't wait for an owner to appear. They pulled the crowd back with raised hands and stern voices. "Stay back, everyone! Keep clear!" one of them shouted. People obeyed, their eyes locked on the vehicle. Whispers filled the air. Some said it was a stolen car, others said it was a bomb. Nobody truly knew, but fear is quick to grow. The decision was made suddenly, an order was given, and the officers prepared fire equipment. They surrounded the car and set up barriers. Without any warning, flames leapt up as the car was set ablaze. The fire spread fast. The heat pushed people even farther back. Smoke rose high into the sky. The sound of metal cracking and glass shattering echoed through the street. People gasped. Some held their phones up, recording the shocking scene. Some shouted at the police asking why they didn't check first, but the officers ignored the questions. They were focused only on destroying what they thought could be a threat. In minutes, the car was burning fiercely, its paint melting, its windows exploding one by one. Children clung to their parents, shopkeepers shut their doors, and strangers who had been just passing by now stood shoulder to shoulder, united by the same shock. The air smelled of burning rubber and gasoline. The crowd's eyes reflected the bright orange flames. It was not just a fire. It was a spectacle, a dramatic moment no one would forget. Through all the chaos, one detail remained hidden from the police. The car was not abandoned. It was not dangerous. It belonged to someone very real, someone who was at that moment walking quietly toward the scene. But the officers did not notice him yet. Their attention was locked on the fire they had created. The man's footsteps were slow, steady, almost too calm for the situation. He wore a simple black jacket, a cap pulled low, sunglasses hiding his eyes. From a distance, he looked like just another bystander, but those who would soon recognize him would never forget this day. As the flames ate away at the vehicle, a silence spread through the crowd. It was the kind of silence that only comes when something feels terribly wrong. Deep down, some people felt uneasy. Burning a car in the middle of a city street seemed extreme. It felt reckless, yet no one dared to challenge the police directly. The authority of uniforms and badges kept them back. Minutes felt like hours. The car that once carried memories, journeys, and perhaps something personal was reduced to a glowing shell. Sparks flew, smoke clouded the sky, and the sound of fire roared louder than the voices around it. People who had never spoken to each other now exchanged looks of disbelief. Some whispered, "Whose car is that?" Others asked, "Why didn't they wait?" But answers never came. For now, the only truth visible to everyone was destruction. The street that had been full of life and noise was now dominated by the smell of burning and the shadow of the fire. What had started as a normal day turned into an unforgettable scene, a mistake that would soon shock not just the crowd, not just the city, but the entire world once the owner of that car was revealed. And as the smoke climbed higher, blending into the sky, the quiet figure stepped closer, still unnoticed, still calm, his identity hidden for just a little longer. But the story was already beginning, a story that would prove once again how humility shines even in the middle of loss, and how the truth always finds its way through smoke and flames. The fire was still burning bright, the flames dancing like wild creatures. The crowd stayed behind the barriers, some holding their phones high, others whispering nervously. The police officers looked serious, their hands resting on their belts, their eyes fixed on the car as if it were a dangerous enemy. The smell of smoke grew heavier. People coughed, and children cried softly into their mothers' arms. Among the noise and confusion, A lone figure appeared from the far end of the street. He walked slowly, not rushing like the others, his steps steady, almost too calm for such a chaotic scene. He wore a black jacket that looked simple, a cap pulled low to cover his forehead, and dark glasses that hid his eyes. Nobody noticed him at first. He blended in with the dozens of bystanders standing around. But there was something different about the way he moved. Unlike others, he wasn't pointing or whispering. He wasn't recording the fire with his phone. He was just walking forward with quiet purpose, his hands tucked into his pockets, his shoulders relaxed, even as the flames crackled louder and the heat reached across the street. Some people turned their heads and looked at him curiously. He seemed familiar, but they couldn't place his face under the cap and glasses. A child tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered, "That man looks like someone I saw in a movie." The father hushed the child, too focused on the burning car to care. As the man reached the barrier, an officer stepped forward, his hand raised. "Sir, please stand back," the officer said firmly. The man didn't argue. He just stopped and tilted his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the car that was now fully engulfed in flames. The fire reflected in his glasses, giving his calm face an almost mysterious glow. The officer frowned. Something about the man's quietness felt strange. Most people at that moment were shocked, angry, or scared, but this man was simply. Still, the crowd behind the barrier also began to notice. Some pointed quietly, wondering why he stood there without moving. Minutes passed like this. The fire roared, and the man stood quietly. The officer shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to push the man back farther or just let him stand there. Finally, the man spoke in a voice that was soft but clear. "That was my car," he said, his words simple, yet they carried a weight that silenced the whispers around him. The officer froze, his mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to reply, but no words came out. Behind him, another officer turned his head sharply, looking at the man with wide eyes. The crowd erupted in gasps and questions. What did he say? Did he say that was his car? The whispers grew louder, buzzing through the crowd like electricity. The man didn't repeat himself. He just kept his calm gaze on the burning wreck. A small smile touched the corner of his lips, but it wasn't the smile of someone amused. It was the smile of someone who had seen too much in life to be shaken by something like this. A smile of acceptance. Slowly, recognition began to dawn on the people around him, the way he carried himself, the quiet strength in his voice, the calmness that seemed almost unreal in such a moment. A woman near the front gasped and covered her mouth, whispering his name in disbelief. Others followed, their eyes widening as the truth spread through the crowd like fire itself. The police officers looked at each other nervously, their hands twitching, their faces pale. If this man truly was who the crowd thought he was, then they had not just burned any random vehicle. They had made a mistake far bigger than they could imagine. Still, the man didn't move or raise his voice. He simply stood there, a lone figure with smoke curling into the sky behind him. His calm presence in the middle of panic made the moment even more surreal. The whispers grew into murmurs, the murmurs into gasps, until finally, someone said it loudly. "It's him. It's Keanu Reeves." The name spread instantly and the crowd shifted. Phones lifted higher, voices called out in shock. Some couldn't believe it, others cheered, and a wave of excitement mixed with shame washed over the street. The police officers stiffened, realizing the quiet man they had brushed aside was no ordinary bystander. Keanu didn't flinch at the recognition. He simply pushed his glasses up slightly and gave a small nod, his eyes finally visible to those close enough to see. His expression wasn't angry, it wasn't bitter. It was calm, almost forgiving, yet it carried a silent strength that made even the officers hesitate. The street that had been filled with fire, smoke, and confusion now held a new kind of tension, the tension of realization, the tension of knowing that a mistake had been made in front of the entire world, and the one person most affected by it was handling it with more grace than anyone could have expected. The lone figure had arrived, and now the story was no longer about a suspicious car burned by police. It was about a man, a humble actor known across the world, standing quietly in front of the flames that consumed what was his. and everyone waited to see what he would do next. The moment stretched like time itself had slowed. The fire roared louder. Sparks flew into the sky. But the crowd was no longer watching the flames. Their eyes were locked on the man standing at the barrier. The whispers had turned into gasps, and gasps into cries of recognition. More and more people began saying his name out loud. Keanu Reeves. At first, some doubted it. The man was dressed so simply. His black jacket plain, his cap low, his sunglasses ordinary. He looked like anyone. But as he lifted his glasses just enough for the crowd to see his eyes, the doubt melted away. Those sharp yet gentle eyes, familiar from countless movies, could belong to no one else. A wave of shock rippled through the people. Some stepped forward as if pulled by invisible strings. Others raised their phones higher, filming with trembling hands. A woman clutched her chest, her voice shaking as she whispered, "It's really him." Children who had been crying moments ago now stared in awe, not at the fire, but at the man who stood so calmly before it. The police officers felt the weight of the crowd's eyes shift onto them. The color drained from their faces. One officer whispered to another, "It can't be, can it?" The other replied in a broken voice, "It is. Look at him." The realization struck them harder than the heat of the flames. They hadn't just burned a suspicious car. They had burned the car of one of the most beloved actors in the world. But Keanu didn't move with anger. He didn't point fingers or raise his voice. Instead, he stood quietly, his expression calm, his hands still resting in his pockets. The fire reflected in his eyes, painting them with a strange glow. It was as if he had already accepted the loss before anyone else could process it. The silence from him was louder than any words. It unsettled the officers. It awed the crowd. It made everyone wonder what he was thinking. Some expected him to shout. Others thought he might walk away. But instead, he stepped a little closer to the barrier, his voice soft yet clear. "That was my car," he repeated. The simple sentence struck like lightning. The crowd erupted. Some gasped loudly. Others shouted in disbelief. The officers flinched as if the words had burned them. One of them stammered, We didn't know." But the words sounded weak, the excuse empty against the truth that now everyone understood. A young man in the crowd shouted, "How could you not check? That's Keanu Reeves." His voice cracked with frustration. Others joined in, their anger not just about the car, but about the recklessness, about the mistake that had turned into a public embarrassment. The phones recording every second ensured that this moment would not stay hidden. It would spread across the world. And yet Keanu's calmness changed everything. He didn't fuel the anger. He didn't accuse the police. Instead, he gave them a small nod, his lips curling into the faintest smile. It wasn't the smile of joy, but of forgiveness, the kind that cut deeper than any words could. The crowd, stunned by his reaction, fell into a new kind of silence. They expected fury, but they saw humility. They expected drama, but they found grace. Keanu looked at the burning wreck, his car reduced to a skeleton of metal and ash, and he simply said, "It's only a car." Those 4 words moved through the crowd like a gentle wave. People blinked. Some even felt their eyes water. Here was a man who had lost something valuable, not just in money but in personal worth. Yet he dismissed it with such ease. His words carried a lesson that no speech could deliver. The police officers stood frozen, unsure whether to apologize or retreat. The weight of guilt hung heavy on their shoulders. One officer finally stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Mr. Reeves, we didn't know, we thought—" But his words faded into nothing, because the more he tried to explain, the weaker it sounded. The cameras zoomed in, recording every detail of Keanu's calm face, the flames behind him, the shame on the officers' expressions. People knew instantly this moment would go viral, not because of the fire, but because of the man's reaction. Children pointed at him, their eyes wide with awe. Teenagers whispered excitedly. Adults shook their heads in disbelief. Strangers who had never met before were suddenly united by the same thought, that humility, kindness, and grace had a face, and it was standing right there, lit by the glow of fire. One woman near the front whispered softly, "That's why people love him." Her words echoed what everyone was thinking. Keanu's reaction was not what they expected, but it was exactly what made him different, exactly what made him more than just a star. The crowd no longer cared about the burning car. The story had shifted. It wasn't about a police mistake anymore. It was about a man's quiet dignity, a man who stood among chaos like a steady flame, refusing to be blown away by anger or pride, and as the flames finally began to die down, leaving behind only smoke and charred metal, everyone knew they had witnessed something unforgettable. The reveal was complete. The world now knew whose car had burned, and the world would soon know how he responded, not with rage, but with humility. The kind of humility that leaves a mark far deeper than fire ever could. The fire still burned, but the real heat now was not from the flames. It was from the weight of embarrassment pressing down on the police officers. The crowd had already figured it out. They knew the quiet man was Keanu Reeves. Their whispers turned to shouts, their disbelief turned to anger, and their phones kept recording every moment. The officers looked at each other nervously, sweat on their brows not only from the fire but from the shame that now surrounded them. They had acted too quickly, too recklessly, and now the whole city was watching. No, not just the city, because with every video being uploaded soon the entire world would see. One officer stepped forward, his voice low but shaking. "Mr. Reeves, we didn't know it was your car." His words carried no strength. The crowd hissed and booed. Some shouted, "You should have checked first," others yelled. "How could you destroy it without proof?" The police barrier that once kept the crowd away now felt like it was keeping the officers trapped. Keanu stood calm. He didn't raise his hand to silence the crowd. He didn't scold the officers. He simply looked at the burning wreck with eyes that showed no anger. His silence made the officers panic even more, because silence from him was louder than any shout. Reporters began to arrive, tipped off by people posting live videos. Cameras flashed. Microphones were pushed forward. The story was already spreading like wildfire. The headline was clear: "Police burn Keanu Reeves's car." The officers knew their mistake had turned into a disaster. They scrambled for words. One officer tried to explain. "It was a safety protocol. We thought it was dangerous. We couldn't take chances." But his excuse sounded weak even to his own ears. The crowd didn't buy it. They shouted louder, their anger growing, their loyalty now clearly with Keanu. Another officer added quickly, "It was just procedure, sir. Please understand." His tone begged for mercy, but Keanu only nodded softly, his expression calm, his body language humble. It was almost as if he was comforting them rather than accusing them. That reaction made the crowd pause. They were ready for a fight, ready to see the actor lash out, but instead he smiled faintly, a smile that carried no malice, only understanding. And he said in a soft, steady voice, "I know you were just doing your job." The crowd gasped. People exchanged looks of disbelief. This man had every right to be furious, but he was forgiving. Instead, the officers blinked, their hearts pounding. The kindness in his words cut deeper than anger ever could. It showed them the difference between power and grace. Phones caught every second. People posted captions like, "This is why the world loves Keanu." And even when his car is burning, he stays humble. The officers knew nothing they said could fix the mistake, but maybe his reaction could save them from being completely destroyed by it. Still, the pressure didn't let up. More reporters pushed forward, asking questions loudly. "Mr. Reeves, how do you feel about this? Are you going to sue the police? Will you demand compensation?" The microphone surrounded him, waiting for drama, waiting for anger. But Keanu shook his head gently, his voice calm. "It was only a car," he said again. "People are more important than things." Those words landed heavy on the street. The crowd quieted. Some even clapped softly. His humility disarmed the storm, turning the chaos into an unforgettable moment of grace. The officers felt a sting in their hearts. Their shame grew stronger. They had destroyed his property, yet he was protecting their dignity with his kindness. They tried to say more, to explain further, but every word felt useless. They realized they were not the ones leading the moment anymore. Keanu was, simply by being himself. The chief of police finally arrived, his uniform clean, his face red with embarrassment. He pushed through his men, his eyes wide when he saw who was standing there. For a moment he was speechless, then he extended his hand. "Mr. Reeves, I deeply apologize. This should never have happened." His voice shook with honesty. Keanu looked at the hand, then shook it firmly. No anger in his eyes, only calm acceptance. "What's done is done," he said. His words simple, but they carried the weight of peace. The chief nodded, unable to believe that the man in front of him had such grace in such a moment. The crowd murmured in awe, some filmed with tears in their eyes. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was about character, about the kind of person who could turn humiliation into humanity. The police, who just moments ago looked like villains, now stood silently, humbled not by punishment, but by kindness. The fire crackled lower now, the car almost gone, reduced to blackened metal, but nobody looked at it anymore. Their eyes stayed on Keanu, the man who had just shown the world what it meant to remain human in the face of destruction. The man who had made the police scramble not because of his power, but because of his humility. And as the cameras rolled, capturing every moment, the world waited eagerly to see what would happen next, what this quiet man would say or do. Now though, the officers stood shaken. The crowd stood amazed, and Keanu Reeves stood calm, his presence stronger than any fire, his forgiveness greater than any mistake. The smoke rose gently now, the flames almost gone, the car reduced to a broken shell of black steel. The crowd still gathered close, their eyes moving between the ashes and the man who stood before them. Keanu Reeves. He had not shouted, he had not demanded. He had only spoken with calm words that touched the hearts of everyone there. The police officers shuffled nervously, unsure what more they could say. Some lowered their eyes, others bit their lips, ashamed that the man they had wronged showed more dignity than they ever expected. People in the crowd waited, holding their phones, hoping to capture the next words he would speak. Finally, a reporter leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Mr. Reeves, are you angry? What will you do now?" The crowd fell silent, waiting, expecting something more dramatic, but Keanu only smiled faintly, his voice steady. "No, I'm not angry. Cars can be replaced. Lives cannot." The simplicity of his answer struck deep. It was not rehearsed. It was not for show. It was honest. People in the crowd felt their chests tighten. Some even nodded with tears in their eyes. His words reminded them of what truly mattered. Another reporter shouted, "Will you press charges against the police?" The question carried weight. The officers tensed, holding their breath, but Keanu shook his head gently. "No, they were trying to protect people. They believed there was danger. I respect that." The crowd gasped. Some clapped softly. Others looked at each other in awe. This man had every right to humiliate the officers, to demand justice, but instead he chose forgiveness. He chose to protect them with his kindness. The police officers exchanged glances, their hearts sinking with guilt. One of them whispered under his breath, "We don't deserve this." The chief lowered his head, feeling humbled. Keanu then turned, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. He spoke not loudly, but clearly enough for all to hear. "It's easy to get upset when things go wrong, but anger won't fix anything. Kindness will." His words carried across the street like a soft wind, calming even the restless murmurs in the back. The people felt moved. The moment no longer felt like an accident or a scandal. It felt like a lesson, and the teacher was not standing on a stage, but right there, in front of a burned car. Some in the crowd began to cheer, their voices rising not in anger but in admiration. "We love you, Keanu!" Someone shouted, others followed. The mood of the street shifted. The flames of anger were put out by the flames of respect. A young boy holding his mother's hand stepped forward, his voice innocent. "Are you okay, sir?" Keanu crouched down slightly, smiled warmly at the child, and nodded. "I'm okay, thank you for asking." The boy's eyes lit up, and the crowd sighed softly, touched by the kindness in such a small exchange. The officers, once frozen with shame, now looked at Keanu with something else in their eyes, respect. They had faced many angry people in their careers, but never had they faced someone who forgave so easily. It humbled them more than any punishment could. The reporters kept shouting, cameras kept flashing, but Keanu's answers remained the same, simple, honest, humble. "It's just a car," he said again. "Don't worry about me. Worry about keeping each other safe." The crowd began clapping, louder this time, their applause filling the street, drowning out the last crackles of fire. Strangers clapped side by side, some smiling, some with wet eyes. The scene felt less like a disaster and more like a celebration of character. The chief of police stepped closer, his voice low but full of emotion. "Mr. Reeves, we will make this right, please. Let us do something for you." But Keanu shook his head again. "If you want to make it right, help the people who need it most, not me." His words hit hard. They were not about revenge. They were about compassion. Even in his loss, he thought of others. The officers swallowed hard, ashamed and inspired. At the same time, the crowd captured it all. Every word, every expression. Videos streamed online instantly. Hashtags began spreading. Keanu kindness. Real hero. Forgiveness. In flames, millions would soon see this moment. But for those standing there, it was already unforgettable. And as the smoke drifted higher into the sky, Keanu Reeves stood tall in front of what was once his car, not as a victim, not as a celebrity demanding justice, but as a man showing the world that dignity, kindness, and forgiveness are stronger than anger, stronger than fire, stronger than pride. The crowd cheered again, their voices echoing through the city streets, and the police, though embarrassed, stood silently, knowing they had witnessed something far greater than their mistake. They had witnessed true humility, the kind that turns even tragedy into inspiration. The fire was gone now. Only smoke curled from the twisted shell of the car. The street looked calmer, yet the energy in the air was stronger than ever. People were no longer watching the wreck. They were watching Keanu Reeves, the man who had turned disaster into a lesson of kindness. As the officers stepped back, unsure of what more they could do, the crowd began to move forward, not in anger but in admiration. A woman in her 30s walked up first, holding out a bottle of water. "Here, you might need this," she said softly. Keanu smiled, accepted it, and thanked her warmly. The simple gesture touched everyone watching. Then a young man stepped forward, offering his car keys. "You can take my car, sir, at least until you get another one." The crowd gasped at the bold offer, but Keanu chuckled gently and shook his head. "Thank you, but I'll be fine." His refusal was polite, humble. His calmness made the young man grin proudly, just happy that his offer was heard. Soon others joined. Some offered him a ride home, some offered food. One woman even held up a bag of homemade bread she had just bought from the bakery nearby. "Please take it," she insisted. Keanu laughed softly and said, "You're too kind." The crowd cheered, their hearts full. The atmosphere shifted completely. What had started as tension and fear became unity and warmth. Strangers talked to each other as if they were old friends. The fire that once divided them now brought them closer, all because of how Keanu carried himself. Children waved at him, shouting his name. Teenagers pushed forward, asking for photos. And even though the moment was difficult, Keanu agreed. He leaned down, smiled, and posed kindly, not as a star trying to shine, but as a man giving joy to others. The crowd roared with cheers as one phone after another captured the moment. One old man in the crowd shouted, "This is why you're different, Keanu." The others clapped and nodded, their voices rising together. "We love you. Real hero. Respect." The words filled the street like music. The anger that once boiled had turned into pure admiration. Even the police officers, who had been the villains of the scene, stood watching in silence. Their shame was heavy, but in that moment they too felt moved. Some even clapped quietly, amazed that the man they had wronged was now uniting the crowd instead of turning them against the police. Reporters tried to push closer again, their voices sharp. "Mr. Reeves, what do you want to say to the world?" But Keanu raised his hand gently, silencing them without force. "I don't want this to be about me," he said softly. "I want it to be about us, about being kind to one another even when things go wrong." The crowd erupted in applause. People stomped their feet, clapped their hands, and some even cried. His words weren't polished or dramatic. They were simple, and that was what made them powerful. Then something unexpected happened. A group of teenagers who had been standing at the back ran forward, carrying a cardboard sign they had quickly written with a marker. It read, "We stand with you, Keanu." They held it high. The crowd cheered louder, and for a moment, the burned car behind him was forgotten, replaced by a scene of unity and hope. A mother lifted her little daughter onto her shoulders. The child waved and shouted, "Don't be sad, mister." Keanu turned to her, gave her a gentle smile, and said, "I'm not sad. I'm lucky to meet all of you." The crowd melted at those words. The little girl giggled happily, and her mother's eyes filled with tears. The street, once filled with smoke and fear, now felt like a festival of humanity. People offering, helping, cheering, supporting, all sparked by one man's humility. It was no longer about the car. It was about the power of grace in the face of loss. The videos kept rolling. Live streams spread across social media. Comments flooded in from people around the world. "This man is pure kindness. This is why we love him. Respect. Forever." The scene in that small street was already turning into global news, yet Keanu remained the same. Calm, gentle, humble. He thanked everyone, shook hands, and made eye contact with strangers as if they were friends. He carried no anger, only gratitude, and that gratitude spread like fire, igniting hearts instead of cars. The police, though still embarrassed, began to understand something. Their mistake had become part of a much bigger story, a story that would not be remembered for their error, but for his forgiveness. One officer whispered to another, "He saved us from being hated." The other nodded slowly. "He saved all of us." The sun dipped lower, the smoke thinned, but the memory of that moment only grew stronger. The crowd no longer wanted to leave. They wanted to stay, to be part of history, to witness the kindness of a man who had every reason to be bitter, but chose instead to shine with humanity. And as Keanu Reeves looked around at the faces smiling back at him, he knew the fire had taken his car, but in return, it had given something greater. It had shown the world once more that true strength is not found in anger, but in kindness. Not in pride, but in humility. And the people who stood there would carry that lesson with them long after the smoke had disappeared. The burned car was nothing more than a black skeleton now, the smoke fading into the evening sky. The crowd still stood close, their eyes fixed on Keanu Reeves, the man who had turned an accident into a moment of humanity. The cheers and support from strangers had softened the sting of loss, but the police officers still felt heavy with guilt. The chief of police stepped forward again, his face pale, his hat tucked nervously under his arm, his voice careful. "Mr. Reeves, we cannot undo what has been done, but we want to make this right. Please allow us to replace your car or give you whatever you ask." His words echoed across the street. The crowd listened closely, waiting for Keanu's answer. Keanu stood still, his eyes calm, his hands resting loosely by his side. He shook his head slowly. "I don't need compensation," he said, his voice gentle yet strong. "It was just a car. I can live without it." The crowd gasped softly, some even clapped. But Keanu wasn't finished. He looked directly at the police chief and continued, "If you want to make it right, use that money to help families who are struggling. Give it to people who need food, who need shelter, who need hope." The words struck deep. The officers blinked in surprise. The chief shifted uncomfortably, not because he disagreed, but because he knew the truth in those words. The crowd erupted into applause, louder than before, their voices echoing off the buildings. "Yes, yes," people shouted, "help the people." The chief cleared his throat, humbled in front of everyone. "We will do that," he said softly. "We will make sure the money goes to those in need." The crowd cheered again, and for the first time that day, the shame on the officers' faces softened into something else. Respect. Reporters scribbled quickly, their cameras flashing, headlines already forming in their minds, not about the police mistake, but about Keanu's humility. Keanu refuses money, asks for help for the poor. The story was writing itself, and the world would soon hear it. Keanu smiled faintly at the crowd, his eyes warm. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we do after. We can choose anger, or we can choose kindness. I choose kindness. His words rolled through the crowd like a gentle tide, calming, inspiring, unforgettable. The people felt a wave of emotion. Some wiped their eyes, others hugged strangers beside them. The energy of the street had shifted completely, no longer about destruction but about compassion. One woman near the front whispered, "This is history," her voice trembling with awe. The police officers stood straighter now, no longer hiding, but humbled. They had come as enforcers. They now stood as students, learning from the man they had wronged. One young officer whispered to himself, "He turned our mistake into something good." As the applause died down, a small group of local volunteers stepped forward. They had been standing in the crowd quietly. Now they spoke. "Mr. Reeves, we run a shelter here for people without homes. Your words give us strength, thank you." Keanu nodded, walked over, and shook their hands firmly. "You are the real heroes," he said, his words sincere. The crowd cheered again. The reporters pushed microphones closer, asking if he wanted to sue, if he would demand a new car, if he was angry deep down. But Keanu answered them all the same way, calmly. "I have everything I need. I have my health. I have good people around me. That's more than enough." Children in the crowd waved at him, shouting his name. "Keanu, Keanu." He waved back, smiling warmly, his kindness reaching even the youngest hearts. Teenagers shouted, "You're a legend." Older men and women nodded proudly, as if they too felt honored to stand there with him. The chief of police raised his voice again. "Mr. Reeves, we will also publicly apologize for this. You have my word." Keanu simply nodded. "Thank you. But remember, actions mean more than words." The crowd clapped once more, agreeing with his wisdom. Social media exploded, clips of the moment spreading faster than the fire had spread earlier. Hashtags filled the screens. Keanu the kind, our true hero, forgive and inspire. Millions were already watching the scene live through phones in the crowd. The world was seeing what humility looked like. And still, Keanu didn't act like a star. He didn't boast or demand. He stood like an ordinary man, but with extraordinary character. His calmness made the police bow their heads lower. His humility lifted the spirits of everyone watching. His forgiveness changed the meaning of the day. The burned car behind him was almost forgotten. It was no longer a symbol of destruction. It was a reminder of grace. The people would not remember the fire as much as they would remember how Keanu responded. The chief finally said softly, "You've shown us something today, Mr. Reeves. Something we won't forget." Keanu gave a small smile. "We all learn from each other," he replied, his voice carrying across the crowd. As the evening sun painted the sky with gold and orange, the people slowly began to disperse, but none of them would forget what they had seen. They had come expecting chaos, maybe even anger. But they left carrying a story of forgiveness, kindness, and humility, all because of one man who refused to let fire create bitterness in his heart. The sun had almost set. The smoke from the burned car drifted away into the evening sky. The crowd began to thin slowly, but the energy of the moment lingered in the air. Those who stayed close still held their phones high, recording the last glimpses of Keanu Reeves standing calmly in front of the wreck. By now, the story had already spread beyond the street. Social media was flooded with videos, news reporters were broadcasting live, and headlines around the world were forming. Police burn Keanu Reeves's car, his reaction stuns everyone. Clips of his gentle smile and forgiving words were being replayed thousands of times. But in that street, it wasn't about headlines. It was about the feeling. The people there knew they had witnessed something rare. Not just the burning of a car, but the burning away of pride and anger, replaced instead with kindness and humility. Keanu spoke softly once more, his voice carrying even as the crowd quieted. "Things can be rebuilt, cars can be bought again, but respect, compassion, and kindness are more valuable. Don't forget that." His words touched every person listening, and the silence that followed was filled not with emptiness but with thought, deep thought. A teenager in the crowd whispered to his friend, "This is better than any movie." The friend nodded, his eyes wide. "Yeah, because it's real." That was the truth. What the crowd had witnessed was not a script, not an act, it was reality, and it was more powerful than fiction. The police officers, still humbled, formed a line and bowed their heads slightly. Even the chief lowered his gaze, their pride broken, but perhaps in a good way. They had been taught a lesson, not by force but by grace. One officer whispered to himself, "I'll never forget this." The volunteers who ran the local shelter stood with tears in their eyes. Inspired by his words, they knew that when the police donated funds as Keanu had asked, it would change lives. Hungry children would eat, families without homes would find warmth, and all of it would be because one man chose forgiveness over anger. As more cameras zoomed in, a reporter asked one last question. "Mr. Reeves, what do you hope people take from this moment?" Keanu looked around at the faces, at the burned car, at the officers standing awkwardly, and then back at the curtain. "I hope people take away that kindness is always stronger than anger, and that we all have the power to turn mistakes into something better." The crowd erupted in applause again, their claps echoing like thunder down the street. People whistled, cheered, and shouted his name. Some even cried openly. It wasn't the loss of the car that moved them. It was the presence of a man who reminded them what truly mattered. Children waved, adults nodded, strangers hugged each other as if they had shared something deeply personal. The burned car became a backdrop, a symbol, not of destruction, but of transformation. People would walk by that street for years and remember, not the fire, but the lesson. Later that night, the videos hit every corner of the internet. Millions watched, millions commented. The hashtags rose to the top of trends. Keanu kindness, the real hero. Forgive and inspire, but more than the tags. People shared their own feelings. If he can forgive like this, so can I. This man is a blessing to humanity. True strength is kindness. The police department held a press conference. The chief admitted their mistake publicly, apologized to Keanu, and promised donations to shelters and food banks. The crowd watching from home applauded through their screens, knowing Keanu's words had turned shame into something good. Meanwhile, Keanu himself refused interviews. He didn't chase the spotlight. He simply went on with his quiet life, as humble as ever. His only statement was simple. "I don't want this to be about me. I want it to be about what we can do for each other." Those words were printed across newspapers, screens, and shared endlessly. People all over the world felt inspired. Some donated to local charities, some called shelters to ask how they could help. Strangers showed small acts of kindness in the streets, offering food, holding doors, lending a hand. One spark of humility had created ripples far and wide. Back in that city, people told the story again and again. Parents told their children, shopkeepers told their customers, strangers told friends. I was there when Keanu's car burned, and you know what? He didn't get angry. He forgave. The story spread not because of the fire, but because of the man. And so the burned car became a memory, not of loss, but of gain. It taught people that true wealth is not in what we own, but in how we treat each other. Keanu had lost a car, but in return, he had given the world something priceless, a reminder that humanity shines brightest in the darkest moments. As the night fully covered the city, the last people left the street. The police cleared the area, and the charred skeleton of the car was finally towed away. Yet the lesson of that day could not be removed. It remained in every heart that had witnessed it, and in every heart that would hear the story. The legacy of the moment was clear. It would not be remembered as the day police burned a car. It would be remembered as the day Keanu Reeves showed the world that humility, forgiveness, and kindness are stronger than fire, stronger than mistakes, and stronger than pride. And the galaxy of people who admired him only grew brighter.